An hour late, but we're on time, so to speak. Golden Black Live, 3 p.m. session. Brian Neubert will join me in segment 1. And he hasn't had a lot of sleep tonight. It was a late night last night as Purdue was able to subdue, put back Penn State with an overtime win. We'll talk about that and many other things in the first segment. Our second segment, guest Justin Lovett will join us, and then Walter Jordan. Longtime Purdue basketball fans know of Walter, two-time first-team All-Big Ten player and two-time MVP as well. I want to thank our sponsors, XXX on the hill but on the level, Purdue tradition since 1929, John Basham and the good folks at Basham Reynolds, already working well ahead to 2019-20. And Hilton Garden Inn when tomorrow's Big Day State HDI tonight, and State Farm agent Trent Johnson at trentismyagent.com. And Brian, there were some dicey moments last night, and yet Purdue ended up getting out of Happy Valley alive and intact, and with the winning streak still intact, I should say. And is it safe to say all is well that ends well with that win?
Well, it depends on your perspective. I mean, a lot went into that could have led to that being a disastrous loss for Purdue, from the things that matter now that might not have mattered a month ago. Right. Now you're playing for your NCAA tournament seeding. You're playing for a Big Ten title. Losing this game would have been significantly worse now under Purdue's kind of new world order here, as opposed to what it would have been a month ago when this looked like sort of a transitional rebuilding, retooling type of season. But Purdue obviously didn't do a good enough job on the glass last night. Purdue turned the ball over too many times there for that stretch in the second half. That was really the beginning of Penn State winning the game. It ultimately didn't win. Purdue needed a lot of luck to win this game. Kind of typical of Purdue and Penn State's history at the Bryce Jordan Center.
Yeah.
Purdue just ripping the heart out of the chest of Penn State in the most improbable fashion. Purdue needed a banked-in three at the halftime buzzer. They needed a missed foul call at the end of regulation, a clear foul that would have probably put the game away for Penn State, and then you get the three in overtime where Carson Edwards draws the foul going up, throws the ball in the basket.
Yeah.
Really, that probably would have only accounted for an extra point.
Yeah.
Because he probably would have made all 3 free throws. But still, that was just kind of the day it was for Purdue. What they needed to happen for them to win that game was probably a lot more improbable than the set of circumstances they would have liked to have had unfold for them to win at Penn State, which was 0-9 in the Big Ten.
Yeah, amazingly.
Prior to last night.
Yeah, prior to that. And the fact that, Purdue goes into the game as one of the best offensive rebounding teams in the Big Ten and still struggling statistically with defensive rebounding. What did you see last night in terms of some of that challenge? I mean, Penn State, I thought, it wasn't as if Purdue didn't give effort. It's just where the ball bounced, positioning, what do you think some of that causality was for Purdue?
I think Watkins was a big part of it.
Yeah.
Purdue's always had a hard time with Mike Watkins keeping him off the glass. Two, I just don't think Purdue just grabbed the ball because a bunch of those rebounds, a bunch of those possessions that Penn State kept were possessions where Purdue had a crack at the defensive rebound, just couldn't collect it. And sometimes those are just kind of the breaks of the games, and sometimes that all kind of snowballs on you where it happens a bunch of times in one game and then it doesn't happen again the next game.
Yeah.
But Purdue just didn't grab the ball when it had opportunities to grab the ball sometimes. That was a huge part. Purdue gave up way too many points last night, obviously, giving up 90 points. I know it was in overtime, but Penn State didn't score very much in the overtime. So giving up 80 in regulation
85 or whatever
to a team that came in scoring 61 in Big Ten play was way too many points. Penn State shot over its head again. That's sort of a trend for Purdue. I don't know how you connect that to Purdue necessarily directly, but it keeps happening, so it probably isn't a coincidence. Penn State shot over its head. Purdue had a hard time containing the dribble. Purdue fouled way too much. I thought Penn State's athleticism at certain positions showed up a little bit, and Purdue just gave up way too many second chance points. The offensive rebounds for Penn State kept them in this game and were almost the reason Purdue lost this game.
How do you explain in your view, the challenges with three-point field goal defense? I mean, Purdue's one of the worst in the league. And Penn State comes in shooting 26%, and I think they were over 50% yesterday in that game. I mean, is that again a function of not being able to contain the dribble, and therefore they're getting good looks? How do you look at that?
I think three-point defense is more about a defense's ability to keep good ones away from teams as opposed to actually stopping the shot. That probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
But it's more about team defense. It's more about rotations. It's more about aggressive closeouts than anything. I think, though, that it is largely a cosmetic statistic because teams are going to shoot however good they're going to shoot, I think, for the most part. But Purdue earlier in the season was a horrible closeout team. They weren't closing out on shooters well. They weren't identifying shooters. They weren't finding shooters in transition. They've done a much better job of that lately. Penn State shooting yesterday, I don't know if I looked at that as Purdue was deficient defensively as much as it was just Penn State making shots they don't always make.
Yeah, and they haven't been making, obviously, in conference play. Wasn't the case last night. You know, you look at Travion Williams, obviously did some great things in the overtime, struggled to some extent, had foul issues, and ended up fouling out of the game. Foul issues during the regulation part of this basketball game, but how big is that he came in and you know, they went to him and he made a couple of big plays in overtime?
It was huge because regulation was basically Carson Edwards and Ryan Klein just taking turns doing all the scoring. All the scoring. Purdue had nobody else scoring in regulation. As soon as overtime starts, they get the ball to Travion Williams. He scores right away. Suddenly, Purdue has balance. Suddenly, things change. Purdue dominates overtime. Nogel Eastern starts getting to the foul line, or I guess being put at the foul line is the better way to put it.
Right.
Makes all his free throws. Travion Williams scores again. Obviously, Carson Edwards' 4-point play in overtime was a huge play, but all the other scoring was handled by other guys, and Purdue did not have that for 40 minutes of basketball, and it was really, really – it's not a coincidence that when other guys start scoring, taking the load off the two guards, Purdue is much better because of it, and overtime was kind of a little microcosm of that.
Yeah, Carson Edwards gets off to a start where he thought he might be going for 60 the way that game started for him. But talk about how he's evolved. Obviously, he's become maybe has had more skill in sharing the basketball. That's helped. But he also, offensively, was just phenomenal, especially in the first half.
Yeah, I mean, for a guy who got 38 points, he got it on 50% shooting. He got it at the cost of only 3 turnovers. I think for as aggressive as he was against a really good defensive player who he lit up in Josh Reeves, I think that it was one of his best games at Purdue. I know he didn't get the 40. It doesn't matter. It was one of his best games because he won the game for Purdue. He was efficient. He made big plays at the end. After playing, he ended up playing 41 minutes in this game, and he still ended up at the end of regulation having the legs to make the game-tying layup. Not that that was an overly complex play. Still made the 4-point play in overtime. Played a ton of minutes, and nobody plays harder on the offensive end, maybe in college basketball, than Carson Edwards does. He works so hard to get his shots. From a conditioning perspective, that was really a picture of peak conditioning because for him to be in that position at the end of the game after playing that much, as hard as he does, I thought really said something about the kind of condition he's in. But also, lately, Carson Edwards just seems like he's trusting people around him more. That trust wasn't always rewarded last night because he had a couple of passes that should have gone for layups that went by the wayside. But he just looks more comfortable in whatever this role he's playing is, however he would define it. He looks more trusting of the people around him. He just looks more settled in. He's made his team better. He's making people around him better, and he's getting he's making his obvious impact as a scorer as well as he did last night, almost to the furthest extent in his career in a single game.
Yeah, 38 points, and again, it started off with almost 15 in the first 7 or 6 or 7 minutes.
That's 2 road wins for Purdue in overtime, 36 and 38 for him.
Yeah, and there's a correlation there somewhere, I'm sure, and I don't think there's any question about that. All right, one of the things that we don't always talk about in this show is the fans, those of you out there and that are watching the show can ask questions, and obviously we had a thing on the site of the class of 2020, and a question from Tri Boiler about he talks about Cryer, Jaden Ivey, and we have something on Cryer on the site today. Morton Walton, who do you think Purdue stands the best chance with? And maybe just an overview of you kind of outlined that on the site this week, but a lot of interest obviously in 2020 kids for men's basketball.
Yeah, I don't know if there's one guy. Oftentimes, when Purdue's going to have a great chance to get a kid pretty early in the process. I don't know if there's a kid like that out there. I know Kerwin Walton.
Yeah.
Really, really likes Purdue. I know that Trey Galloway. A lot about Purdue makes a lot of sense for him. We'll see where they end up in the end for him. But I don't see a guy where Purdue's the clear leader right now. That's not to say they're not, but I just think Purdue's recruiting a lot of really high-end players, a lot of guys who are going to have a lot of options. And Purdue is probably a co-leader for all of them. Yeah. And the percentages say when you're in that situation on that many kids at this point, you're going to get your share. But I don't know if there's that one kid where Purdue's going to get him. Sort of the way it was with like Vince Edwards, Dakota Mathias, some of those guys very early in the process. Purdue basically had them at hello. Isaiah Thompson, obviously, Mason Gillis, obviously. I don't know if there's that one kid out there where it's pretty clear Purdue's going to get him. But they're in on enough really good players that you would think that the law of averages would be Purdue's best friend here.
Yeah, for those who don't know, what's the breakdown in terms of numbers for 2020 at this point? I mean, it's hard to tell.
At this point, we really, I can't even answer the question because Purdue has up to two scholarships it can use in the spring. I believe it's going to use at least one. I promise you that. It could use two. If it uses two, then Purdue only has one scholarship to give in 2020 if everything else holds as it is right now. If Purdue uses one scholarship, then it has two scholarships in 2020, and so on down the line. If it uses none in the spring, it will have three. I assume. I think I'm a little bit sleep deprived here. The scholarship numbers kind of get my head spinning sometimes. But the reality is Purdue's 2020 class again, and it's been this way every year for Purdue because they always go into the spring with scholarships and they don't always use them. It's always a situation where the spring guides what you have in the class after, and that will be the case more so than ever this year.
All right, we've watched Purdue, I think, for 21 games. I want to question about Evan Boudreau and his play. Obviously, he's gotten in the last couple of games and coming back off the injury. His role, I mean, he comes in handy when you had Harms and Travion Williams with 4 fouls last night. Is that what he's going to be, or how do you see him helping the rest of the season?
That's a tough call because, he's not the physical presence Travion Williams is. He's not the physical presence Matt Harms is from a dimension standpoint. He's not the defender Matt Harms is. He's not necessarily the offensive player or the defensive rebounder in Big Ten play anyway that Travion Williams is. Travion Williams is playing so well, and he's transformed Purdue. And really, I mean, you hate to put it this way, but he got hurt at a really bad time.
Yeah.
That opened the door for Travion Williams.
Okay.
Travion Williams ran with it. And you just don't know. The thing with Boudreau is, from a defensive perspective, the 5 is clearly his best position.
Yeah.
Clearly. But the size, obviously, isn't ideal. And it's noticeable when he's out there. You notice the drop-off in sheer presence from a physical perspective when he's out there. Purdue has not. The plus-minus is an extremely flawed measure.
Yeah.
Obviously, because any number of things can factor into it, not necessarily reflect on the player you're looking at. But there are metrics that show there's been a drop-off when he has been on the floor. And he was Purdue's second or third best player in non-conference play.
Right.
And I don't know if it's been Big Ten play, if it's been the wear and tear of the season, whatever it may be, but he's just not been as productive in Big Ten play. He's struggling at times to get his shot off around the basket. He's not rebounding at the same level he did earlier in the season. And the two guys around him are playing really well too, and that's probably the most important part of this. This isn't necessarily an indictment of him as much as it is the fact that Matt Harms and Travion Williams are both playing at a really, really, really high level, and that shouldn't get lost in all of this. Everybody wants to talk about who's not playing before they talk about who is playing and how well they're playing.
Eric Hunter also did some good things, I thought, in his first appearance of the game. maybe not as much in the later on. But talk about his development. And here's a guy that is getting some important minutes, especially early in games, and yet he's a guy that one would think is definitely in the long-term plans of this program, and has shown some ability to do some good things. He did that against Michigan State as well.
Yeah, there's a story on the site right now that I published yesterday, which would have made me look bad had Purdue lost at the last place team in the league. But he's kind of the poster boy to a certain extent of what Matt Painter said a couple weeks ago, that part of the improvement of his team has been the players on his bench, which is synonymous with his young players, because they're all young players, starting to understand what they need to do to help Purdue win. And Eric Hunter kind of gave me a good anecdote about that, in the sense that everybody remembers the Maryland game. When he came in on Anthony Cowan, he might as well have had a siren on his head, Eric Hunter, because Anthony Cowan went right at him. He got that little brief reprieve of having to go against Nogel Eastern, and he took full advantage of being guarded by the freshman. And that was sort of the game that Eric Hunter realized that, well, first of all, he came into the season, everyone knowing that, and this is true of every young player, the bigger issue is defensively. The bigger transition is on defense, typically. And that was very much the case for Hunter, but the Maryland game for him was the one that really kind of hit him in the face. And it was then that he sort of realized, I have to defend if I want to play. And now, you know, the anecdote I used was he guarded Cassius Winston on Sunday, a couple weeks after guarding Cassius Winston in East Lansing the first time. Did a great job, relatively speaking, against one of the best players in the country, one of the best point guards in the country. He did a really good job, and that's where he's made the greatest progress. He's no longer a defensive deficiency. You don't notice as much when Eastern goes out of the game and Hunter comes in. But also, he just seems so much more comfortable out there. He seems more confident. He made big baskets at Ohio State. He made big baskets against Michigan State. He's just absolutely settled in now, it seems like. Earlier in the year, he looked nervous. He looked jumpy. He looked skittish. He looked like a freshman. And now he looks like a sophomore. He looks like he's settled in. He looks experienced. He looks comfortable. And he looks like he's going to be a really good player at Purdue.
Minnesota on Sunday, Super Bowl Sunday, noon start. The Golden Gophers have had, you know, they took Michigan to a last-second shot that they had an opportunity to win in Ann Arbor. Is this a game Purdue should be worried about? I mean, every game Purdue should be.
I don't think Purdue's graduated past the point of worrying about anybody. I think they have to stay. They have to stay on edge, as Painter says. I don't think the Penn State game was anything about handling success. I don't think it was anything about maturity, because they started the game really well. I thought just the way the game unfolded, Penn State had an opportunity to get its head up. Again, as Painter said, I'm starting to talk like Painter, which is troubling. But I just thought Penn State was kind of a maturity check for Purdue. But now that the game's unfolded, I don't think it really had anything to do with that. So I don't think Purdue is at risk necessarily of overlooking anybody. I don't think they're wired that way. I also think that they went through enough difficulty earlier in the season to where they're probably realizing that there's certain things they have to do to be successful, because they've seen what happens when you don't do it. You lose a lot of games in really disappointing fashion. And but obviously Minnesota is not to be taken lightly. They are very different from when they were really bad a couple years ago. They don't have Nate Mason anymore. Purdue is glad he's gone, but they do have Amir Coffey back, and they really missed him last year. Amir Coffey is a terrific player, and obviously Jordan Murphy, for a team that just couldn't keep Mike Watkins off the glass, Jordan Murphy is that guy, and the energy he plays with, as hard as he plays, it's they obviously have players, you know, and
kind of a
the
strange,
good news, you have it at home. And
it's a national holiday, almost Super Bowl Sunday. It's kind of a weird. I know it probably didn't impact the players as much, but it is kind of a strange thing to be playing noon on that day, and there's so much other stuff going on. Maybe not in Central Indiana in terms of a team being there rooting for that because of the call against Drew Brees, but that's another topic. But the last question, I mean, you know, Purdue's focus has been good all season, at least of late, and I'd expect it to be that way.
Well, it was terrible at Michigan. But that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And, you know, all of the things that happened earlier in the season are pretty much off the table now.
Yeah.
Because it seems like, well, I don't know if anybody at any point this season is going to take things for granted.
Yeah.
I think Purdue's graduated out of some of its inconsistencies, eccentricities, however you want to term it, from earlier in the season.
Well, going to be interesting to see what happens on that front, and I think that this will be a very, very interesting February and March for Purdue basketball. Pretty good January, though, for the most part. Just one loss for the Boilermakers in the month, that loss at Michigan State. All right, we're going to let Brian go on and do his Upon Further Review, which is one of my favorite things he does, and especially when he hasn't any sleep, it ought to be extra good. And Walter Jordan will be joining us here in the next segment, and then Justin Lovett, segment 3, will tell us a little bit about what the conditioning of the Purdue football team and how that's going so far. Always interesting and great to have him on. So we'll take a 2-minute break, come back with Walter Jordan. Look forward to doing that on Gold and Black Live.